Building Men is brought to you by Finish the Race Apparel, FTRapparel.com, the creators of all things building men, and by Become Stronger Industries, become-stronger.com, the creators of handmade steel maces, hammers, and other badass equipment.
It's a practice of non-identification, because for me, I'm like thinking all the time, and I can get caught in these conversations, which a lot of people do, or caught in emotions. So if you can just, like, anytime it pops up, especially if you're doing a task that you're being pulled away from your focus, just say like, oh, actually there's a thought. Oh, I'm thinking. Oh, like, oh, that's an emotion. Because the more you can observe it as something that's not you, the less it has control over you.
You're listening to the Building Men podcast with Dennis and Anthony Morolda, brothers on a mission
to help you become the strongest version of yourself, mentally, spiritually, emotionally, and physically.
What's up, bro?
What's up?
How's it going, man? So, we're in studio today. It's our second guest that we've had in studio. We're gonna have two guests in studio today, and so we're working through
It's exciting.
the niche of having a studio guest,
Having a human body next to me.
body. And our guest, you have to let us know if Anthony starts getting too close. The last time there was a lot of rubbing of the thigh. You didn't realize you were doing that. He was in studio.
No, I didn't. And then I got a call the next day, and they were
still
very
dealing with the legal ramifications of
that. It's bullshit, stupid. We were both just having fun. Listen, I think he was enjoying it. I didn't know. If you don't say you don't like it, how am I supposed to know?
Right.
You know?
The nonverbals were positive.
They weren't great.
They weren't great.
But
so I also noticed that you're drinking is that a kombucha? Is that your
kombucha?
Tell us what kombucha is first of all before I ask a follow-up question.
It's like a form of a probiotic, and yeah, it tastes really good. And I'm drinking a straw.
You're drinking it with a straw. That was going to be my follow-up question. I noted, so the straw is just barely peeking over the edge, the rim
tip.
of, just barely peeking over.
Yeah, I can.
And it's a paper straw.
That's right. Save the turtles.
Save the turtles.
Helping out the planet.
Why? Tell us why.
I don't even know why this bet came up. I think it was when we were talking about hitting people with spitballs who are wearing masks outside.
We talked about the paper straw then.
And then we talked about the paper straw then, and then I think I made a bet with you, and we did it on the 100th podcast about. We didn't say what the bet was at this point.
So we were in studio, and now the audience might have heard the Sweaty Balls episode where we did a reenactment of the SNL skit, The Sweaty Balls, where I was Terry Rialto, you were Margaret Joe,
yeah.
And then Tara, our sister, was Pete Sweaty.
Yeah.
And so we did a reenactment of it, and we're in studio trying to do that, and we kept fucking up in the beginning. So we basically said, all right, we're going live.
Dude, but I was nailing it. You were nailing it. I was the only person who didn't mess up. And then right when we go, this is like, I forget how many takes we did at this point, but it's like our 11th one, and Dennis turns to me and goes, first person to fuck up has to drink out of a straw for the next 6 months. And I was like, oh my, and all of a sudden I just felt like the pressure come on. My performance anxiety just like hit the roof.
You came in 2 seconds.
Oh my God, I blew my load in the first hour. That was it. Oh God, yeah.
On camera.
So here we are. Now
So we said until Denny's birthday, which is March 25th, you have to drink from a paper straw.
Yep.
Every time that we're together. And if you don't have a paper straw and we're together and I catch you drinking out of something without the paper straw,
we add on?
Add a month on to it as well. So you could potentially have to drink out of a straw for the rest of the time that I see you in my entire life. And it makes me so happy watching.
The first day we went to a bar and I had a beer with a straw. I was drinking at it. One of the most emasculating things to do is like you're sucking on a little schwartz with a beer. Takes away any
that'll be part of
the
promo for this episode will be a picture of you just at the Hob in Bordentown.
When I'm fumbling around with it in my tongue, like that's probably the worst part.
And listen, what a great bet. You think about bets that you can make with another human being. Drinking out of a paper straw, everything you drink when you're with that person, it's a great bet. Right? It's a great bet.
Yeah, I agree. You get to just sit back and watch me mess around with a straw.
That's it. So before we bring our guest on and introduce our guest, We pulled up into the studio today. This is the first time that I'm meeting our guest in person. We've talked via Instagram a couple times. And he gets out of his car, he gives you a hug, and he sees me, he goes, wow, you're taller than I thought.
Okay, all right, listen. There was a weird angle going on. There was a slight, slope in the pavement there. So I get why he's, and you came out and the sun was setting behind you. And, it was just the perfect lighting setup.
You've seen us together in different, areas, and you're tall. You're 6'4".
Yeah.
And I'm a little bit taller today. You're a little tiny bit taller.
And I'm just a little taller than you. So
let's welcome our guest onto the podcast. He is a writer. He is an artist. He is the co-host of the Bridge podcast, along with Sean Nixon, who was one of our first guests way back in the day. And he is the host of The Weekly Way, which is a podcast and is a newsletter. Welcome to the Building Man podcast, Johnathan Matthew. What's up, my man?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think I saw an eagle flying behind you when you stood up there.
That's
too.
What.
And it was.
He walked out. He goes, "John, how are you?" You're enormous. Wow.
I think I saw the straws in your backpack, and that made you a little bit shorter.
Yeah.
Speaking of, so when we go out and I asked the bartender, I'm like, "Do you have any straws?" And he's like, "Yeah, your drink does not require a straw. We all got beers." And I said, "It's for a bet. Do you have any straws?" And he brings out the one paper straw.
Yeah.
And or cardboard, whatever that is. It's like a hard paper.
I don't know.
It's
when it gets wet, it's all moist and mushy after, so it doesn't make a difference. It doesn't hold its form.
So I said to him, I'm like, where do I get a carton of these? How can I get a carton of straws? Where do you buy them from? Is there like a large chain like at Costco or something that you? He brings out a bucket of a thing of straws.
Like a pallet.
There was 10,000 paper straws. He just gives it to me.
Yeah.
So I put it up under my shirt. I'm like, all right, let's go. We're getting out of here right now. I throw him a $20 tip for the straws, and I'm like, let's bounce.
And we booked it out of there. Yep. And now I have 7 straws in my backpack just in case. I can already feel this one starting to mush, and I can't even get up enough. I can't get enough liquid in my mouth.
No, you can't.
And that's why you got in trouble with Joel Glotfelty the last time. Right?
Listen. Yeah.
So it's funny we mentioned the first time that we met each other, and you see the person for the first time. It's weird now in this space as we're meeting people and we're speaking to someone. You see them on Instagram, you see them doing what they're doing, or you listen to them on their podcast, and then when you finally meet that person in person, it's this this thing you're meeting a famous person. That's when I started. I was like, oh man, I've watched those
thank you.
You're real. Yeah.
It's a weird thing.
I didn't catfish you. It was like some 10-year-old girl comes hey.
Wait a minute.
Who would be the person that you would see right now that you would go fangirl on?
Probably. That's a tough one.
That's a big question.
Yeah, probably right now. Probably an MMA fighter, probably like Dustin Poirier, nice. Who lost this past weekend, unfortunately. Or like DC, Daniel Cormier, if you know him. Yeah. Or Brett Favre is one of my all-time favorites. I'm a huge Packers fan. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. So when Brett Favre went from the Packers to the Jets to the Vikings
to the dick pic,
what's your favorite angle of the dick pic that you've seen of him?
I like one's on your wall. Yeah.
Yeah. I like the old vintage black and white one I made of it.
The shadows.
Right.
Yeah. Absolutely. You got to get that down.
We'll go back to the eagle. So far, leaving the Packers going to the Jets and then to the Vikings, especially when he went to the Vikings. What was that like as a Packers fan? Did you still love Favre?
Oh yeah, I was. Some people were crazy upset. It's fucking Brett Favre. I'm a Brett Favre fan no matter what. And I was rooting for, if the Packers lost, I would root for him. He had some crazy games with the Vikings. People forget, Tom Brady's doing some ridiculous stuff right now at 44, right. But Brett Favre was slinging it. Had some crazy games in his last year. So, but yeah.
And it's interesting. I think about with Favre's journey as well. He was that gunslinging guy, but you think about. He had some games where I think it was his father died.
That was the famous
that I remember that.
It was against the Raiders.
It was on Monday night in prime time. Yeah. Threw 4 touchdowns. One of the best games of his career.
Yep. And as athletes, right now we're talking about people that we see, and the 2 guys that you had mentioned. I was thinking you were going to go Jordan Peterson, or you're going to go a deep intellectual thing. You went UFC and you went Favre as your 2 guys. But athletes hold that level of when we see them, we're like, oh my God, I'm in this space and there's this professional athlete. And they're just dudes.
They're just
really just
human
dudes
beings.
who might be a little bit better in one area.
I actually met D. This is funny because I actually met DC. I used to live out in the Bay Area for a little bit, and I went to go train at AKA, which is, if anyone knows MMA, like one of the biggest gyms in the world. They're trained there. I just went there to like sign up. This is when I was attempting to become like an amateur fighter, going down that lane, a professional fighter. And I walk in, and it's like, you're seeing like professional fighters. The first time I've ever been around professional fighters, and they're just like walking up around you, and you're just like, I was like 21 at the time. I was like, oh my God. And then DC just comes up next to me, like at the front desk, and just talking to the lady there. And like, he sees me out of the corner of his eye, just like drool coming out of my mouth and just like quivering. And he just got this kind of look. Yeah. And dude, it's funny too, because like you say, you don't know what people look like. And like, he's a light heavyweight. Just a massive human being, you know, and like you have no context until you see somebody in person. Like I thought maybe, I thought you were short, like 5'3" or something like that, but like for some reason, I don't know why. Maybe because I've seen you before. I know how tall you are. I've never seen you, so.
Also, like I took it as like the compliment, but really like people are seeing you as this massive figure. What am I?
I also know that like you are a broader, larger human being, just in like stature and again
structure.
Yes, like I am a little more slender. I have
svelte.
Yes,
this svelte is a good word.
Svelte, yeah. But yeah, I agree. Like, you don't realize how huge, because when you see these people on television in a football game or something, they're around other athletes that are the same size as them. And like us normal folk, they're a different breed of human being when you're next to them and you're like, holy crap. Like, I can't imagine. When you see their stats, you don't understand until you actually stand next to someone who's
built different. Built different.
And I think we just had Stevie Baggs Jr. on, who played in the NFL and CFL he was on 10 different teams or 11 different teams over his career. He played for 10 years. But he gets on, and he is a preacher. Dude, he is just like the way that he was speaking. I was waiting for the basket to come around so I could throw money into it, or like get up and start singing.
Let me tell you something. We need to liberate. Confiscate. Do you understand me, brothers?
And you're like,
yes, I am. I am part of the Stevie Baggs church. But we started talking to him. It's via Zoom. His arms are
they're the biggest arms I've ever seen.
I was like, can I touch your arms via Zoom right now? I was like,
can we virtually do this?
Can you touch them for me?
And that's and that's when Dennis wasn't allowed to speak to Stevie Baggs anymore.
Okay. Put him in the corner.
We all have our boundaries, and we're learning.
What's the number of restraining orders you guys have?
It's only 6 right now. Right? I think there's 6, a couple pending.
Yeah, half a dozen
pending,
give or take. A couple pending. We're not really sure yet, but we're learning, and that's the most important thing. Now we know not to ask someone to touch their arms while we're on Zoom with them. We know that now.
With Whale, with Baby Whale, and
listen, just
So who's your fan girl guy or gal? God. Who's the person that you see and you'd be like, wow, this is the person?
Honestly,
I can't wait to hear this.
Honestly, I feel like it would be Dennis Quaid because I hate him so much. Now listen,
what?
I've hated Dennis Quaid with a passion my whole life. I don't even know why, just his like mannerisms when he's on screen. And if you watch some of the movies that he's in, the faces that he makes, and like when I was younger, I would watch like Day After Tomorrow and Any Given Sunday and The Parent Trap. And again, I've seen like all of his movies that he's been in, and I'm
just
like,
to hate him?
And it was like, when you don't like something, but you just can't help but like you're infatuated by it.
Yep. I love to hate you
right now. Yeah, but I just couldn't stand him, and I feel like he's been in my life for so long, and if I saw him, I don't know what I would do. I'd be excited and mad, and it would.
I think you would love it.
I think so too. I think I'd like jump into his arms, and like he would take me away, princess style.
He's in good shape too. He's for his age.
Dennis just used to send me like shirtless pictures of Dennis Quaid all the time, and he's shredded. And he's like, "You don't look like Dennis Quaid right now."
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's interesting. And for your 30th birthday, one of the things that we got for you was. They're not fat heads, they're just gigantic heads. Like you see that they put behind the backboard when someone's shooting a foul shot in the NBA, something like that. 2 different pictures of Dennis Quaid that were gigantic, and then one of Anthony.
And that's what
There's
I want.
a picture of Anthony that, and he needs to come back in the studio.
I know. I have him in my room.
Dennis Quaid?
Yeah. A little shrine to him. Might just...
Well, when you pull him off the ceiling, you got to bring him in. And
right.
bring
I got to clean him up a little bit.
So I got a Brett Favre dick pic. You got Dennis Quaid.
Right.
What do you
All right,
got?
so my guys are, I have 2 as well. One is Howard Stern. Growing up, working with our father, he helped raise me in a weird way. We would work with our father, and I remember it was when we were working in North Jersey, it was on 92.3 K-Rock. He was on from 6 until 10 or whenever the plugs were done. And if we were working closer to the Philly area, it was on 94.1 WYSP. And I remember we would listen to classic rock. We'd start work at 4:58, 5 o'clock in the morning. For the first hour would be classic rock in the dark. You couldn't turn the lights
we didn't
on.
have there was no electricity. We couldn't put on any.
And then at 6 o'clock, Howard Stern would come on, and we would listen. In the beginning, it was before he was on satellite radio, so they couldn't say masturbate or jerk off. They had to say pleasure yourself. They couldn't curse.
Yeah.
So like listening to him talk to people and be able to pull stories out of individuals, I remember thinking, wow, that's really fucking amazing. Plus, it was funny and the whack pack and the whole nine. I remember that it sucked working with Dad, but being able to laugh through that experience was really amazing for me. And the other guy is Tony Robbins, and he's a guy a larger than life individual, and I think he's 8 feet tall.
He looks tall.
Gigantic. I think he's 6'7" though, or 6'8".
He is actually
I think
gigantic,
he's like
though.
6'8".
Yeah,
and he just has large features. Like he has a head that's just enormous.
Yep.
I mean, everything.
And we've talked about all of his body parts on the show at some point or another.
We've discussed them.
He engulfs you with his presence.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter what he's saying. It's just I want to listen to him. His voice.
It
sounds like thunder. It's like Zeus would sound like from the clouds with a lightning bolt. It's Tony Robbins.
Yes.
So those would be the 2 guys. I'd love to have them both in a room and have a conversation with both of them. Like what an
things I would do to you. I wouldn't do to a farm animal.
But think about how. One thing that I've taken from both of them, the Tony Robbins piece is the really motivational piece that you believe that you are better than what you thought you were. And he talks about you change your story, change your life. That whole thing has resonated with me. And when I left education, somebody was like, where do you see yourself? How do you know that you've made it? And my vision, like as I'm like manifesting shit, what do I think? It's being in a spot in front of a large audience, and Tony Robbins is like, all right, welcome our next guest, Dennis Morolda. He's going to come tell you a story. Like that to me is how I made it. But then I also think about the reason why you can get to a point is authenticity and being transparent and just letting the shit out there on the table. For such a long time on the podcast it was so structured and scripted and corporate feeling and education feeling, and it was you that you're like, dude, you gotta fucking loosen up your ass cheeks.
Yeah, unpucker.
Yeah, really, because for a long time, and I could remember the conversation, having that conversation with you, and it was such a great piece of advice. You didn't recognize at the time that one piece of advice, how it stuck with me. And I relate it to Stern because he's like, listen, here's everything. Here's what I do well. I'm neurotic. I have a little penis, even though I'm 6'5". I'm this. Saying what he wants to say, and people are drawn to that authenticity. Yeah. So those 2 guys wrapped into one. That's my wheelhouse right there.
You're doing great at emulating that, brother.
Thank you. I'm trying my best. And you're doing great with Dennis Quaid.
Thanks.
I'm still working with him, and even though he doesn't know it,
my death threats and then like love letters right after. He's like, what the fuck is going on?
It's like Jimmy McElroy from Blades of Glory.
Yeah.
And that kid loves him, but he wants to kill him.
Yes, that's exactly what it is.
Oh my god. It's an underrated movie.
That's like a part of our playlist.
Great.
Or like
when they do the move and they're
the Iron Lotus.
Oh, and at one point they're 69ing.
They are amazing. It's so amazing. Just the soundtrack alone on that is legendary.
The Stroke, Billy Squier, The Stroke became one of the songs. It was part of my workout routine. Just listening to everybody.
It's beautiful. It's so good.
All right, so you mentioned that you're out in the Bay Area, you're out in California, and you said you met DC and you're you want to train to be a fighter. Tell us, one, how did you get to that point? So walk us up through your story where you're in that space. You're like, all right, I'm going to be at a gym. I want to be a fighter. So walk us through your origin story.
The origin story. All right, started in 1928. My grandmother was born. No, so, yeah, this is an interesting podcast because I feel like we've been in each other's orbit for a long time. And men's coaching, like you met Zach and everybody, and I've connected with a lot of these people. It's been like a really important part of my life. I didn't really know that I was going to connect with that, but it felt like almost inevitable. And so when I was 6, my dad passed away. So that was like the year 2000. And that still has had ripples throughout my entire family. The loss of a father is, very, very significant. And like an origin story, there's usually some disastrous loss, like Batman loses his parents, right? And that really, as I've grown to understand psychology, spirituality, and, just the human condition, I've really had some time to reflect on how that's affected me, my family, my relationship with my family, my relationship with the outside world, and my own identity. And so starting there, like I remember like it's very, very vivid for me. I remember, and I have a very good memory. So like I remember memories from when I was like 3, when I was 2. But most of my memories from him were when he was sick. So he was like sick for a significant part of my life. He had a hospital bed in our living room. I would go and sit and play cards with them. There was a nurse that would always come. Like very few memories I have when he was like when he was himself.
Yeah.
And that's interesting because for a long time, it felt like I never really knew him. Even though like I was 6 years old, I had 6 years of experience, but how much of that was I able to really understand who he was? So I hear all these stories from like my cousins every time I'm with them, my mom, and what was he really like? And I remember maybe around like 7, 8, 9, maybe that ish age, like I started to kind of adjust to that kind of more significantly. And when I say that, it's funny because like when your dad dies, like people are like, you got to be the man of the house, like that's a thing. And one thing I do now is I'm a facilitator for grief counseling. So I work with teens right now, but kids in general, and just like as a support group for people who've lost parents, siblings. And in my training for that, it's really interesting how we approach death. And especially the loss of like a parent or a loved one. And I took on, whether it's appropriate or not, and I'll get into that maybe at some point, but taking on that role of like the man of the house is like a different thing. You almost have to shed a little bit of your childhood identity and give up that. And I had a very supporting family, loving mom, my sister, and my grandparents were always around. So I had a good support system. Not everybody does when they lose somebody. But it really shaped who I would become later. And my mom is a very, very sensitive, very like on the feminine, like strong feminine energy. And I was always a very sensitive kid. So like I was very shy. I was, again, very sensitive, emotional, very in touch with that feminine side, much in part because of my mom. And I remember like when I started to hit like puberty-ish around like 6th or 7th or 8th grade, I think that's when I hit puberty. I don't even remember now. It just kind of happened. It's like, oh, my pee-pee's hard. Okay. There. I started to like resist that because I felt like my mom was awesome for one. Let me get out of the way. But she was definitely like coddled me a little bit. Like I felt that even if it was true or not. And I never had really any like strong masculine figure besides my cousins who would come around very sporadically. And so that made me shift and gravitate towards like the very, very opposite. And that's when I started to get into martial arts. I did it when I was a kid. And it's kind of like the way most kids do. It's like a 6-year-old who does like karate for a little bit and stops. But I wanted to play football actually because I was a Packers fan, I was a Brett Favre fan. And I wanted to be a running back. That was like my thing. And so people think I'm a Packers fan because of Brett Favre, but I was an Amon Green fan. If you guys remember Amon Green.
Yeah.
Who was ridiculous as a running back.
Like 2 years. He was really good. 2 or 3 years.
Like 1,800 yards. He was good. And so that's what I wanted to do. And there was just like not any like really great programs around me. So my mom took me to Tiger Schulman's, which is like it's a big franchise now, but it was like a small, like a little karate gym, like in the, shopping center mall. And I remember going there and getting into it, and it was like, oh, it's okay-ish. But then they kind of switched from karate, like Tiger Schulman's karate, to Tiger Schulman's mixed martial arts. And that's kind of when, like if you know MMA, that's when, like, Chuck Liddell fought Tito Ortiz, like, the second time was when I, like, first got into that. So it was still very new, but still very exciting, like, that in that time. And I remember they started doing grappling classes and, like, boxing classes, and I started to get really into that because, like, all my, like, I loved comics when I was a kid, so, like, Batman, like, all those things. Watching Dragon Ball Z when I was like 6 and like 12 a.m. because it's only on then, like in Cartoon Network. And so just like that, like hyper masculine energy of just like fighting and feeling like strong and powerful. Because I never really did. I was always like very shy, very introverted. And I remember like the very first, and I'd done a bunch of sports like soccer on and off. I did lacrosse for like 1 year. I, random things. But I remember they had this like a big tournament. For everybody, kids and adults too. But it's like everybody on the East Coast from all the different gyms come in these tournaments for grappling, essentially jiu-jitsu, I didn't realize what it was then, and kickboxing. And so they decided to sign me up. I just decided to do it when I was like in 8th grade, not really knowing what to expect, but I just know that I really, really liked it. And I became a fan of the UFC and was following it, and like I was going home and watch videos. And I remember I got to like it was in the Edison Event Center, if you know where that is, but like a big stall, tons and tons, like thousands of people there. And like I was always very afraid of, I was never afraid of getting hit. Like I was never afraid of like taking a punch, or I was always afraid of losing. I was always afraid of failure, like many people are. And I remember my first thing was the grappling tournament, and I'm like about to vomit, like adrenal fatigue right before, like this 8th grader is like about to pass out. And then I go up in my first round, I win that one. The kid was not very good, but I won. And I was like, oh, like I just like felt the experience of like getting kind of like a fight-ish, which I never had. I went to prep schools, like that doesn't really happen very often. And then I got the next fight, it was a little bit tougher, but like I won that one, and I just kept going. And I remember like not even the final, like the semifinal, like, and I had gotten there and I was feeling good. It went to like double overtime, and like I won on like the very like last 3 seconds of just like this like all effort out takedown, get 2 points and go to the finals, and I ended up winning the tournament. And it was like the first time I'd ever really like won something, and like felt like that pride of accomplishment of like achieving something. And I remember looking at my like my coach or like my sensei at that time, and he was looking at me and he had this look of just like surprise, but like oh shit, like I didn't realize like that's like, seeing potential in you, right? And those are significant moments when you recognize someone sees potential in you, right? Because it's like it's that external validation of just like approval. It's like, oh, I'm good at this. Like this is something I'm good at. Because everybody asks you like, what do you want to be when you grow up? And you're just like I always said architect because I was very artistic, but I never really was like emotionally invested into it. It was just like appease the adults, and it's like architect. And like, oh wow, he's going to be an architect.
Right.
That's so great. He plays with Legos. He's so brilliant. It's like it's a little more complex than that. So after that, I was hooked. Like I was like, this is like my thing. Like I made that part of my identity, and that's a big part of what I do. As like a spiritual teacher, I'm a yoga teacher as well, and just a philosopher in general. Is the human condition or the problem with humanity is it's just one gigantic identity crisis, right? And the moment you're born, you're given all these identities to try on, right? And Ram Dass, if you're not familiar with Ram Dass, I'm a huge fan of his. If he was alive, that would be my guy. Him and Alan Watts would be my guys, but they're dead. We're given these like suits to try on, like these identities, and you start to identify with your identity. That's the whole point. It gives you the sense of security. And so fighting was always became that sense of security for me. And I knew like right then and there, like I want to become a professional fighter. Like that's what I want to do. Like I'm seeing like Chuck Liddell, like Frankie Edgar, who's from Toms River, down here in New Jersey, represent. Like that was like one of my idols. And so I went to a prep school too. And so there was this really big tug and pull of just like, my dad had passed away, and he told my mom, like, I just want my sister to go to good schools, get a good education. So my mom listened, and she made me go to all these really good schools. And so, like, here I was, like, wanting to become a professional fighter, and my mom's, like, paying me for me to go to prep school to do all these things. like, and get this higher education. So I felt like this guilt of like pursuing this path that felt like who I was, and like honoring, my mom and my father with like taking like the formal education route. And so high school year, senior year, I get into Penn State, which is where I ended up going for college, for architecture, funny enough. And I'm at this crossroads where I was like, I want to be a fighter. And at that time, too, like my current coach at the time, who played a really big role in my development as a man, too, or as a male figure, he said, like, I really think you should stay and train to become like an amateur fighter. Like, we'll get you up in the ring. And that's like all I ever wanted to hear, Yeah. But I got into Penn State, and now I had this like opportunity that very few people ever get, to go to college like that. And I ended up going to Penn State, and I ended up honoring that. And I decided to train while I was there. And college was very, very difficult for me. High school was difficult for me, but I just was very unaware of how difficult it was until later. I had a very, very severe social anxiety that I didn't even realize till after college. So I went through maybe about like 8-10 years of my life with that. Very, very depressed, engaged in self-abusive behaviors, suicidal ideology, and those things really got me to a break. I barely got through college, essentially. And by the time I graduated, I was like the most freeing thing. It's like, I'm going to just give it one shot to go become a fighter, because like I had been so up and down with being on track with it, not because of all my issues. And so I moved out to California with my friend to the Bay Area to train at AKA. And I signed up to go train there, and I'm training, and then like my body starts to shut down. Like my immune system starts to shut down. My digestive system starts to shut down. My endocrine system starts to act up and be weird. So I had to stop like training, and it was this like awful feeling of just like I got here, like I made it here, like through all the bullshit, and I'm finally here, and now my body's giving out on me. And I stopped, and I was just in this crisis, and a big part of moving out to California is like I wanted to get away from all the awfulness on this side, and it's like I'm going to run away from my problems, and it's like if it's sunny enough and bright enough, I'm doing what I love. But you can't run from your problems, obviously. Everybody knows that. Maybe some people don't yet. And those feelings started to come back to me, and that really negative stuff, that really, really dark place. And I ended up getting a job. I went and I actually decided I was going to get a job as a personal trainer out there because like I studied kinesiology and nutrition. I switched my major. And like the day of me going to accept the job, I called the lady. I'm like, I can't do this. Like I can't. Like it just didn't feel right to me. It didn't feel like aligned with me. And like I had this panic attack. I'm like, I can't take this job. So I didn't take the job. I ended up working at a smoothie bar instead of an Equinox, which is really funny. Very interesting experience. Like I met Tim Cook because this is in the Bay Area. So like the CEO of Apple, Dan Franco came in one time, and like he's really short. So speaking of height, like he's very tiny. Some like Miami Dolphins player. So it was an interesting experience. But I'm working there, and at this time, like that's when I started listening to Joe Rogan and all, like getting into podcasts. And I'm talking to one of my friends. He works at the front desk at the gym, and it's a bunch of us. We're just talking. There's nobody in the gym at like 2 p.m. in the afternoon, and he's telling the story about his friend who was working out on LSD at the gym, and like some people were like, "Oh, that's really interesting." Some people were like, "That's like really, really weird." And so like everybody else leaves, and I'm like, "Say, did your friend have any LSD?" And he's like, "Dude, the friend is me." Like I was telling the story about me, and I was like, "Oh shit." So like rewind in college, which I didn't talk about this. So freshman year, I'm an architecture student, and after I had an awful freshman semester in terms of grades, but then I met this one friend, my friend Ashton, who's one of the best like technical artists I've ever met in my life. But massive stony, but also jacked as fuck. He's like the weirdest mix of like a brilliant artist, like super stoner,
ruining all stigmas.
Exactly, just destroyed them all. And so like I started getting really into smoking with him, like a lot. Like I smoked a lot of weed, like my second semester, and like I did bad in all my classes except architecture. I was actually pretty decent in that. And we would always hang out and just like smoke. And at the very last day of finals, he's driving me back to my dorm, and he stops me at the stop sign. And he had this we call it the Methmobile because it was like this periwinkle blue, like Daewoo or something like that. And it was the sketchiest looking vehicle ever. He turns to me, he's like, hey, do you want to do some acid? And I was like, fuck yeah, let's do some acid. And so we were just like laughing and driving. It was the sketchiest thing. He went to go get some guy, because this is like in a college town. The guy was very sketchy, and the tabs he got had pictures of Jesus on them, so you make it even more sketcy. And so like I didn't know what any of that was. It was just like a drug I was going to do. I was very reckless at the time. It's like, fuck it, end of the year. And so we do acid, but we are like drinking, we're smoking, and this ridiculous, obviously, experience on acid, and all the fun visuals and cool stuff. And I think we watched Fear and Loathing 2 at the end, which is like a weird, just an intense movie. But the very end of the trip, and so it's like, when I say end of the trip, it's like 5 a.m. now from the next day, but I still have tons of energy, and like the sun's coming up. I'm just like outside, just like sitting in the grass, just like massaging the grass. And then this wave comes over me. It's like, I don't want to do this anymore. Like, I don't want to be an architect anymore. Like it hit me, and it was weird because like it didn't feel like it was my own thought. Like I had never had that thought before. I was like, I want to be a fighter. That's what I want to do. And so like I told Ashton, like at that moment, he's like, hey, I think I'm gonna drop out of architecture. And he's like, what? And he's like, yeah, I just got this feeling. So that's when I switched my major in nutrition and kinesiology, because I'm like, this will at least benefit me in some way towards becoming a fighter. And so that's what I studied. And so that's why. And so I'd done acid a couple times with him over the years, like mushrooms once, but again, it was always in a very just like very casual, like very like party-ish environment, so I'm like, but I'd read about like potentials about like, acid to be like, this breakthroughs and opening your mind. And at that point, I was like, I need something. I was at that place where I was in my head. I was like, I just want an answer. Like I kept saying, I see an answer. Like, God, give me an answer. Like, what do I do? What do I do? And then he gives me this guy at the front desk with some acid. Yeah. Yep. And the LSD scene in the Bay Area, if you don't know, is like top notch, because it's like tech CEOs, Stanford CEOs, everybody's microdosing, and like you're getting like high quality, high potent stuff. And so I pick it up from him. He gives me 5 tabs, and and he said, he's in my car. He's telling me, okay, so like I did like half of one, which will like get you pretty far. He said, so I would probably like around starting with like a quarter or so, something like that. To start and like see how it feels. You can always do more. I was like, okay, cool. And so like I'm in my room. I tell my friend Jimmy to like sit for me, just like in case chaos happens. And I do all 5 tabs because I'm like that's how much I felt like I needed the ultimate breakthrough. Like I'm gonna nuke it. Just push the red button on myself. And so I did. And and it was at that point like. The most insane thing, one of the most insane trips I've ever had, because I've had multiple. And like I remember Jimmy took me for a drive because we're in California. We went like out in the mountains or something like that. And if you've ever seen Doctor Strange, when the city folds up on top of each other, it was very like literally without exaggeration, very much that. To the point where I'm in the car with Jimmy, and he doesn't know what's happening. Like he's just driving, and I'm just like, oh, this is just like, I'm just like imagining this. This is just like, I'm in my room still. I'm just going to open the door and walk out into the living room. So I open the car door and I get out. I'm like, oh shit, nope, I'm not in the living room. And I come back in and he's like, dude, what the hell? I was like, nope, we're just going to keep going. Let's forget about it. And so the funny thing about that trip is that I was so far into it and had no idea where I was, that I didn't really get any lessons from it. So I'm in my room sitting back at the end of the thing. I'm like, that didn't help at all. Like, what? Fuck.
10 next time.
Yeah, that's what. Just keep going up. More is more. And so luckily I get some more from my friend who was like, dude, what the fuck? I told you to take a quarter. I'm like, I know. I won't do it this time. And so my job at that time was working for a company that did nutrition consultations and body composition scans and health stuff for tech companies. So it was a very flexible schedule. And this Thursday morning, I go out to the beach. I have a tab and I have a little edible because like, I had my medical marijuana license at the time. And I'm like, okay, I'm just going to have like some time to myself. I'm going to the beach, sunrise, and just see what happens. This is the second time doing it. And so I'm on the beach. There's maybe like one other person there, like an old Asian guy crabbing, which is pretty cool. And so I'm just sitting there watching the waves. And at that moment, like I have this vision of major moments of my life that I didn't remember. It was almost like repressed or suppressed memories from like a third person perspective though. It's like your life flashing before your eyes, you could say. I saw like major pivotal moments. And in that moment, I felt this wave of just release and compassion. It felt like the best hug you've ever had in your entire life. In that moment, I just broke down in tears because I saw all the pain that I was pushing down. I saw all the times where I didn't let myself feel things because I had to stay, stoic, or I had to keep myself guarded. I couldn't be vulnerable. I saw moments in my life that just made me weep for myself. Like I never afforded myself that to cry for myself and to allow myself to feel those things. And that opened up my whole experience. Like that was the experience that triggered where I am now. And not too long after that, I ended up listening to Alan Watts randomly on the radio, and that brought me down a whole spiral of spirituality into Kundalini Yoga, which is another major thing that I teach and I practice. If you're not familiar with Kundalini Yoga, it's very popular now, the idea of it in spirituality. But Kundalini energy is the serpent energy at the base of the spine. So as you meditate, it rises up the spine. If you've heard of the chakras, it goes through all the chakras and it reaches the top. And that's awakening or enlightenment or oneness, right? So the divine feminine sits at the bottom of the spine and rises to meet the divine feminine, or the divine masculine at the top. So Shakti Kundalini is the divine feminine. And so I started meditating, getting into spirituality, meditation, and I started having these wild experiences. Just like I didn't even know what breathwork was at the time, but I just through practice found that breathing different ways changed things, and I would have, without any LSD or anything like that, these experiences that of higher consciousness. And I would see this woman. I would close my eyes, and I would see probably an eagle fly by in my awareness, like this iridescent eagle, and then a pair of eyes would show up, in the corner of my awareness. And that was after 40 minutes of meditating. I'm clear in mind, and I'd make eye contact with the woman. And as soon as I make eye contact with those eyes, I see this gigantic smile, and I would just kind of get rocketed into the ether and the higher states of consciousness. And so that at that moment, I remember this is the most important thing I've ever experienced in my life. This is the most important thing, and it's happening to me right now. And so my whole perspective, I gave up the idea of becoming a fighter, and all these labels I had, and I was like, this is it. I'm being told, I'm getting the message, I have to focus on this. And so I didn't listen and still tried to become a fighter at some point, and went all these labels, became a trainer, which even though I was decent at it, wasn't really my calling. It was always the spiritual, and I kept coming back to the spiritual. And so the divine feminine is played a really important role in the development of my own masculine energy, because there's a balance, of feminine and masculine. And the main philosophies that I study and practice are yoga, specifically Jnana Yoga and Kundalini Yoga, Taoism, so the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu, and then Advaita Vedanta, which is non-dualistic philosophy. And so through studying those, practicing those, my own meditations, and learning from the variety of teachers, Alan Watts, Ram Dass, Rupert Spira, Krishnamurti, a lot of these teachers of spirituality, I started to understand all the layers of identity that I had taken on, and all that is a sense of security. Because in the physical world, we seek security. That's one of our prime instincts, right? As a biological organism, we want to be safe in our environment. We want to be safe physically. We want to survive, and so that idea of survival transcends up to our mind and to our sense of identity, right? So we talk about group identity is safe, right? This is why there's such tribalism, such a thing in politics and religion, because we feel safe when we have an identity. And what I discovered is that during all these spiritual experiences, like the one I had with LSD or my meditation ones, what was happening was I was going through ego deaths, which is another thing you have heard of, but it's this death of the identity. You're essentially going through a death experience of who you think you are. And it can be very, very frightening, because you're losing the sense of self that you've clung onto for so long. Whether it's good or bad, it's funny. You cling onto the bad things too, because it's better to be familiar than unknown. And you don't realize that until you're at that moment where you have to let go. And that's a big part of spiritual teachings and practices, is you're going to have to let go at some point. When you die, you will let go. There's no holding it. So Eckhart Tolle says the goal is to die before you die. So it's to get rid of this illusion of who you think you are, to become aware of who you actually are. And a lot of people try to put into words, and I used to try to put into words, and I don't anymore because it's almost futile. I just kind of teach people how to get there, the practices to get there, and how to be compassionate, how to study your own mind, how to stay disciplined, which is a big part of that practice. But that's the work that's changed my life, and I think that's really what I'm here to do. And I think that everybody's capable of it. Spirituality feels like this weird niche where you have to be like super into crystals and like hemp all the time and like astrology, but it's like, no, it's like literally everybody's having a spiritual experience right now, whether you believe it or not. And I always say, like, if you don't believe that, like, the most important things in your life are spiritual experiences, because how are you going to scientifically explain to me how much you love your grandma or your kid? You can't put that into words. You can't measure it, right? Most of our world is just an accumulation of measurements about things, right? We treat things as objects to which we measure and observe. But like, who's observing that, right? And that's who you're getting down to. That's the practice of Jnana Yoga, is you keep asking who I am or who am I until you rid everything you're not, and you're left with just pure awareness. So I know I just threw like a massive amount of stuff at you.
That was a big origin story.
And now I play crime on the weekends.
Right.
And
I wrote down, I mean, as far as we love to create a working title. And right now I'm working on Consciousness, Identity, and Jesus LSD tabs. where I'm starting with.
Sounds about
initially.
Right.
Yeah. I'm sure we'll go in another direction. So you went through your experience with the death of your father, how you identified with masculinity, your drive to become a fighter, and how that wove through wanting to do right by your dad's wishes for your mom, for you to become this student, going down the path of not here. We talk about that often on the show. I love looking over and seeing you drink out of the straw. I just do it for you.
There's no way to do it inconspicuously as I'm fumbling.
Portion control.
Absolutely amazing. And taking that, talking like through everything else that you've been through the yoga, through the LSD trips, through consciousness. The biggest question I know the audience has is, what's your favorite smoothie to make? I mean, that's burning question I had the entire time.
Out of all that, that's what we come out of.
So we had something called...
here. We're definitely...
You're up here. We like to bring it
It was
down.
all like fitness-based, so they had like funky names. Like there was one called the Muscle Up, which was just like plant protein, almond butter, almond milk, and then like some other random stuff in there. They were decent smoothies, but it was just like...
And then there was like pre-workout stuff you can throw in there.
No, we didn't do pre-workout.
No,
it was more like
a Smoothie King.
No, it was more like it was called Earth Bars. It was very like holistic, naturally kind of like smoothie stuff. So it wasn't like junk smoothies. Like we used matcha, we used like spirulina and stuff like that, and like so it was like good stuff, but it was like it's a smoothie bar. It's like an overpriced smoothie bar. As most smoothie bars are.
The price up a little bit. A couple of the other things that you talked about, we got to dive deep into a couple of these areas. Working in a smoothie bar, you deal with some assholes. You definitely do. Did you ever pick your nose and put it in the
No, I never did that.
What was the worst thing you ever did to somebody's drink?
I never did anything bad. No, that was always like one thing. I was always, ironically, like I had so many issues with myself, but I was always like really good with customer service. Like if I had people who didn't like my coworkers, but like would like me instead, I just like had that kind of energy of just like. I was a people pleaser for one, so like you learn to have that chameleon kind of vibe, so you kind of match their energy, and they're like, oh, even if they are a dick. That's one thing I always say to like young kids, men or women, is like there's a couple of jobs you should always have. I think you should always do something with like physical labor. It doesn't need to be construction, but you use your body, use your hands. It's really important. You should be in something with sales. Not that you need to become a salesman, but learning how to interact in that kind of environment and the economy that we have. And then some sort of customer service or food service specifically, because you will get a lot of assholes and you will have to not be an asshole back to them or risk losing your job, right? Patience. And so that was a really interesting time because you met, like, I would meet tons of people who like didn't have the fucking time for a guy working a smoothie bar because they're like a CEO of a startup and they have to fly over here. And it was... this one guy, he was actually kind of a dick and like a really big misogynist and kind of a racist. But he was like one of these, I felt bad for him too because he was the kind of like old guy who it felt like he didn't have a good relationship with his kids. So like everybody he met that was my age, he would always try to like pass on some wisdom to me because he felt like he didn't have anybody to give it to.
Right.
So I would always listen, even if he was kind of a dick. One time he came in, he's like, I've always wanted to do this. he's like, he just pulled out $100 bill. He's like, I'm as a tip. And I was like, oh shit, so like there is some niceness in the asshole, like there's a. So that was an interesting experience. Besides, Tim Cook, Dan Franco, anybody else famous I met or interesting? No.
Well, it's like that show, The Undercover Boss. Or
yeah.
Like, it's interesting how people treat you when you can't give them anything, when there's no expectation that you can do something for them. Are people going to treat you with respect? Are they going to treat you like a human being?
Yeah.
Or are they going to treat you like, oh, he's a fucking guy that works at a smoothie bar? I remember in my job as a principal, not that it was like this huge hierarchy, but there would be some people that I worked with that treated the secretaries, that treated the custodial staff, the cafeteria workers like lower human beings. And I remember thinking, this is no good. You can't to be that person. How you treat anyone is how you should treat everyone. Like I really believe that. That's a deep thing there as well.
Because I feel like we didn't really tackle your story at all. We're more talking about the smoothie bar and everything.
The smoothie bar is the most important part of
the
story.
That's our biggest takeaway.
Smoothie
bars are great. Your experience that you had with meditation, with breath work, with LSD, with taking this time to look inward, I feel like is the expectation that everyone has going into meditation. Like, I'm going to have this visualization and find myself and totally get it. And then when it doesn't happen, they're disappointed and they're like, fuck this, why am I doing this? And like, was it first your ability to just let go and kind of surrender that allowed you to have those experiences?
So having done it before in college was very helpful with my friend. And like, I do think I'm not one of those people like make LSD and mushrooms like super recreational legal. Everybody should do it. Like, I don't think that. Like, I think it should be used as a medicine because it's really, really powerful. That's how I've used it. I've used it to fuck around, but like that's like this much of important to like the benefits it can have. And if you've followed MAPS or any of these like psychedelic organizations, they're researching it for therapy, and like Berkeley and Johns Hopkins, it's like the most effective treatment for like PTSD and trauma and abuse. So I'm a major proponent of that. But yeah, like I'm lucky in the sense that before I even started meditating, I had that experience. So like I knew there was something deeper if I just kept going. Whereas a lot of people I work with now as a yoga teacher, as someone who teaches mindfulness too, is like I hear this a lot. It's like meditation doesn't work for me. And it's like, well, the issue there is you think meditation is supposed to work for you. Like there's nothing to be worked. And that's why I love the Tao Te Ching, because it's the whole thing. If you ever read it, it's very small. Like it's not a lot. It doesn't need to be thick. It's just full of paradoxes, right?
How did you hear that, Ant?
Too many. Too many.
Just like that straw right there. It's
I know.
That's how big it is. Yeah.
Exactly. This is just circling back around. Love it.
But yeah, it's like when you can. And this is why I connected with Zach initially. Like I found his page because he's very counter spiritual culture, because I don't like a lot of what I see in spirituality, which is like what he has talked about. It's like this like toxically positive, overly woo-woo, just like too far out there to the point where like you're like, who are you helping by doing that besides everybody else who already agrees with you? Like it's not going to reach the average person who can benefit from that. So I try to make it manageable and amenable to like the super stressed out, like, mom in New York who doesn't like fuck around with crystals, but like she could clearly use some help, It's that we have this desire and expectation and these fears. We want something out of everything we do, right? Like, and that's why it's very rare to find like true unconditional love, because like very rare to find somebody that you don't expect anything from. Like, even if it's just like this tiny sliver of validation or appreciation, it's very hard to just be that open space. So when you meet people like these gurus or sages, and they have that energy, like the reason you feel that is because they don't have any of that. They're free. They're an entirely open container. And so when you're in their presence, you don't. The reason why it's so enlightening to be in their presence is because they reflect back to you in such a clear way. That's not there if you have all these other layers of like expectation involved. And so to go back to your original point. With meditation and that magic experience, it's really not about getting anything from meditation. Like it's not like there's a lot of things like meditate to be happier, meditate to be less stressful, like, and those are just byproducts, right? Like if that happens, it happens, right? But like meditation is essentially just sitting in silence, and it's like it's almost too easy, which is why people don't like it. Like people like to do things, right? Like, it's like fitness, right? Like people would rather just like run around and do random workouts that they see on the internet than just like squat and deadlift and bench press. It's like that's just too simple. I'd rather put a band and like a Bosu ball and like and like do some weird thing like this, you know, like because like the more I do, the more effective it'll be, and like that's like do less. Like that's really it. Just do less. And I always have to tell myself too, and it's all an ongoing practice. Like don't try so hard. 'Cause sometimes I try too hard to meditate, and like you get in a space where like nothing's happening. Like I want this answer. Like just do less.
It's funny with meditation for me. I started meditating when I was going through my own shit back a year and a half, almost 2 years ago now. And I downloaded Headspace, and Andy was the guy that I listened to.
Hello, Dennis.
Yeah,
my name's Andy.
Hello, Dennis. And welcome back to
I couldn't wait until the point that he told me, like, okay, now just let your mind free of everything and don't just let it do whatever it wants to do. That was finally when I was like, okay, now I could do it. To me, meditation was something that I wrote down that I needed to check off. That I would do at 6 a.m. every day. Like, okay, I'm going to wake up and put it in my journal, my high performance planner. I'm going to wake up, I'm going to drink water, I'm going to meditate, I'm going to journal, I'm going to go off and do my workout. So it became something that I was checking off. Plus, you would get to the end of it, and there was a happiness one on managing anxiety, managing stress, financial instability. So I'd get to the end of it, and I would want to see when I finished how many minutes that I did. And it became like accumulation.
It's like that
gamification.
Western mindset way of thinking.
It was creative, so I wasn't getting out of it what I truly needed to, because it became something that I had to do, not that I was choosing to experience.
Yeah. And those apps can be helpful for just getting you in the routine of things. Like I've used Headspace before. But when and again, that's the paradox. It's like, well, like people always want to know, like, how do I, that's why I'm like very not on board with like a lot of the manifestation people. It's just like, you know, a lot of it's just like sales things and like selling you an idea of what you want. And it's like, I want you to not want anything. Like, and like, if I don't want anything, how can I get anything? And that's the paradox, right? You have to be entirely open. And I did a trip not too long ago where I was, you know, I'm having my own just like blocks with business and things like that. And I was at this kind of like, I had wanted this really big answer, and at the end of the trip I didn't get it. And so it was like, and so I'm like sitting there, and like in my mind the question I kept asking, like, how am I going to do this? Like, how am I going to do this? And like there's, every time I had that question, like this gigantic knot of tension in my chest, like I can't get rid of. Like, how am I going to get out of this? Like, wow. And then the idea just kind of came, not from my own mind, but just came into my head. It's like, well, what if you're not supposed to? And then like the tension released entirely. And it was just acceptance of loss, acceptance of failure, which is an acceptance of death. Like all fear stems from the fear of death. If you can get down to the root of it, right? And that's why we cling to things. And that's why having an ego-death experience, that's why psilocybin and psychedelics can be so positive, is because when you experience that ego death and open up into, you know, pure awareness, like none of the stuff you thought mattered. Like it's very, very freeing. It's very, very, like, the most free you'll ever be. And but nobody wants to give it up. Nobody wants to give up the experience, right? Like you think you'll lose things by being unattached, but it's your attachments that are preventing you from really appreciating something. And relationships are a really good way to see this, because I've been involved in like a codependent relationship on both sides of it, as being like the one who was too needy and the one who had like somebody too needy on them. And like, is that real love? Like when you get in these certain relationships where I have this expectation of you, where I'm overly attached to you, it feels like love, because like attachment means I want to be close to you, but attachment means I'm afraid of losing you, right? And so there's this weird tug of like, I love you, but I'm afraid, I fear at the same time around loving you. And unconditional love is no conditions, right? It's like you could leave me, you could hit me, and I would still love you. And that's like, you get to that, that's like a guru level place, because if someone hits you, the instinct is to hit them right back. And there's a really good, it's a Ram Dass lecture, but he's quoting a master of Aikido who tells his story of at the time this Aikido master was just a student, and he's learned all this stuff about Aikido. And if you know anything about Aikido, as a martial art, it's called the gentle way, right? It's really, it's not this very physical, it's using people's energy against them, very much like judo. It's a very non-aggressive martial art. And he's on this train and this like belligerently drunk asshole comes on there, and he just starts harassing everybody and screaming at everybody, and making a scene and kicking things out of the way. And the Aikido guy's just getting a little bit upset, and he's observing him, and the guy calls him out essentially, and he's like, this is what I've been training for. Like, I've trained to fight this guy. Like, I'm going to use my techniques. And then before he can engage with the guy, this old man sitting down says, he just calls out pleasantly, like to the drunk guy. He's like, "Hey, what's how are you doing?" And the drunk man is just like confused, and he just was like says something angry at him. The old man's like, "Oh, please come, like tell me more about it." And he's engaging with the guy where everybody's like afraid or running away or angry at him, and this old man starts sitting and talking to the drunk guy, and the drunk guy sits down, and he's like, I feel angry all the time. And he starts opening up to this old man. He's like, "Well, like, what? Tell me what's going on." He's like, "I just lost my job. I just lost my wife, and I feel like a piece of shit." And the man lays his head down the old man's lap and starts crying. And the old man's just like petting his head. It's like, "Yeah, it'll be okay. Just continue to tell me more." And the master of Aikido was watching this all go down. And he said, "What I was prepared to do with combat, the old man did with kindness." And isn't that the gentle way? And so, especially as far as masculinity too, with martial arts too, and this aggressive energy that's associated with masculinity, like, it doesn't have to be that way. It's just an imbalance is all that is. And everything's just about finding the right balance. I forget even what I was talking about there. The original question.
That was beautiful.
Yeah.
And that's why smoothie bars are just the most important part of American economic stimulation.
There was a reason why I asked that question. Well, I want to get into the grief work that you're doing. I wrote down 2 things as you were talking, and I'd love to hear about your work with kids that are dealing with grief. We talked about grief a couple times on the podcast, and about it. It's that one emotion that there's not a standardization with how people deal with it.
Yeah.
When somebody's happy, you understand what it looks like, sounds like, feels like, sad, angry. Grief is something that it's a little bit different. So talk to us a little bit about what you see when you're working with kids with grief. And then you talked about identity and grieving for the loss of an identity. How does that look? I'm thinking about having to rewrite who I know I am, and there is a loss of who I was before the loss of this identity. Is there a process of grieving when you lose a specific part of your identity?
That's a good question. So I got into... So I started my own business this past year, Johnathan Matthew LLC, and one thing I was like so obsessed with the business, because once you start something, like, I love to do it, and like I'm really like happy and engaged all the time, but I kept getting this energy during like my meditations. It's like serve others, like stop focusing, like and instinctively it's like, oh, how's that gonna help me do my thing? And then it's not supposed to. You're not supposed to understand, right? Just like accept the unknown. And so I live in these apartment complexes by the canal here, or down near Princeton. And I've taken that same road to get to my apartment like thousands of times, probably literally. And it wasn't until I started thinking about, like, instead of like figuring out business, like maybe I should just go just like give my time or like help in some way. I was thinking like some sort of counseling, like, because I've always thought like that was a path that I wish I had gone down before counseling. And I'm driving back home one day, and I'm driving back to my apartment, and I see the sign "Good Grief," which is the name of the company. I'm like, huh, like I've seen that sign so many times, I've never actually stopped to think what it was. And it's a grief counseling organization, like a non-for-profit. Like literally, I walk there, like it's that close. And so I decided to contact them and become a facilitator just this past year. And it was very interesting because it felt like really as close to home as it gets, because I, as a child, like I know I did not process my dad's death in like any sort of healthy way. I know that my family, like my mom, my sister definitely didn't either. We just never became that good at expressing that with each other. It's a very weird thing. And so the grief training was really interesting because, they've been doing this for a very, very long time, and they mostly work with kids, but some adults who lost spouses and kids. And there's this such a stigma around it. And it's one of the things that stuck out to me more is that our narrative around how we help others cope with it. Because there's a couple things you'll hear, like almost unanimously if you go to a funeral, right? You'll hear, at least they're at peace now, they're not suffering anymore, or like they're looking down on you, or it's almost these kind of like, when you're in that space and someone's crying, like your natural instinct is like, what can I do to comfort this person, right? Like, and it's actually like kind of counterintuitive, as a lot of things are. Like, it doesn't really help that much. Like, it's actually potentially even like a negative thing, because what it does is it blocks you from experiencing that emotion when you should really just be like feeling with them, right? So it's like it's a move from sympathy into empathy, and from empathy into compassion, right? And the most important part about compassion is just holding space before you even do anything that makes somebody feel better. Just be there with them, rather than trying to like make them feel better. You know, like they're not supposed to feel better now. Someone died. Yeah, it's close to them. And people will say like passed away. And one thing we do is we say the word dead, because like, and it's not meant to be harsh, but it's like that's what it is. Like when we try to like sugarcoat or make it something it's not to appease something, we're not letting them experience the reality of that. And like we're finding out more in our society that kids need to understand deeper things at an earlier age, for sure, to be able to deal with them, or they go into adults that don't know how to cope, and then they become bulls in china shops and destroying everything in their own lives and others. And so I work with teens, so there's a bunch of kids. I signed up for the teens because like little kids terrify me, honestly. I just don't have the energy to deal with them. Yeah. Like I have some friends who are just like perfect with kids, and it's just not me. I've always vibed with like teens that I've worked with, because like they're like smart enough to understand my witty, clever humor, and like they're close enough to me that I can kind of like, and that's when I had my hardest time, was when I was a teenager. Yeah. And there's a confidentiality about where I can't talk about certain things in the people's families, because whatever we talk about stays there. But they come once every other week, and it's entirely free for them to sign up. And I get about like, depending who shows up, like 5 to like the most like 8 or 9 kids, and they're all high school kids. And it's really, really fascinating to see how each one of them, with different personalities and different family situations, processes everything. And you get a mix of like denial, you get a mix of kind of like aloofness about it, and you get some like really deep diving into like feeling it. And some people have lost stuff like very, very recently, and some it's been a while. And having that space as with other kids is really, I do very little. My job is to just like facilitate the conversation with different topics they have each week, make it somewhat fun and engaging, that they want to be there, but help them to open up and, you know, not pry and poke, but create space. And help to teach the other kids how to create space for their peers too, because that's really important. And one thing I hear a lot from the kids is that their friends don't know they can't talk to their friends very much about it, because it's like their friends just don't know what to say or don't know what to do, or they change the subject to make it lighter. And so they don't, like, some of them like have never really even talked to anybody about it. Some can't even talk to their parents about it because they don't have a good relationship with that parent. And it's funny because they don't see it yet, and I see it in a lot of them. But like I see how that is already impacting like their relationships, like their friendships, like how they view themselves in school. And like I'm very aware of like what my role is. Like I'm not a therapist there. I'm purely a volunteer facilitator. So there's like there's a line that I cannot cross, but all I can do is get them to dig deeper. But it's sad work, but it's like fulfilling, because I know, because they all feel better. Like at the very end, like they're all really, really happy to be there, and like they're learning. Like it's been since September. Like they're learning how to like talk with each other about it, and how to be supportive, and not how to do that kind of bypassing of like feelings. And sometimes it just takes one kid to spark that within everybody else.
And it's interesting, like the understanding that kids are going to go through grief in their own way. There's not a specific way for them to go through it, and they're all going it on this specific journey. But I think one of the things that we all struggle with is trying to make sense of it. You know, you're saying, you know, how different kids are experiencing it. How do you make sense of, you know, a newborn, stillborn? Yeah. How do you make sense?
You know, when people would say,
Julie says it all the time. People say it's God's will.
Well,
you know what? Fuck that.
Yeah.
Like how do you talk to kids in that way when somebody's telling them in a more, you talk about spirituality? Well, this is what God intended. How can you say that there's a fucking serial killer on the loose? That's okay for him to go and still live. Yet a girl that's 7 years old dies of cancer. I can't make sense of it myself. How do you go about helping kids make sense of that?
Yeah, and a couple other ones of those things that people say. It's like everything happens for a reason. It's like, how the fuck does that help me?
Right.
And how does it help a kid?
Yep.
It's like you're telling me that God wanted my dad to die, right? Another thing too I'll bring up, because it doesn't get talked about much, and I didn't even think about this till they talked about it, was our relationship with disease too, especially people who die of disease. And it's this very like combative, aggressive way. Like you're always fighting cancer. So like when a kid's dad dies from cancer, do you lose that fight? Like what are you putting into someone's mind when we use our language, right? And it's like, because like some kid had actually asked that, like, did daddy lose? You know, like, and that's like, you don't really think about that until you, like, oh shit, like I wasn't even realizing I was using that language. That's what we just say, like, fight cancer, like we're winning the battle.
Yes.
And like how that's well-intentioned, but can actually be counterproductive and destructive. And that's one thing we don't try to put a label or like a meaning to anything, right? Because it's like we're helping them find their own meaning within their own grief. And like you said, grief's not a linear process. There's like that stages of grief, and that was made in a very acute sense for certain people, like who actually made that. I forget the name of the lady. But grief is not linear, right? And it's meant to be linear. It can be a lifelong process. You know, it is a lifelong process. You're never really like done grieving, right? You just learn how to understand your own experience, understand your relationship to that people. And you mentioned, I don't think I touched on like identity, but like for me, like, you know, it's funny because like people say like I remind them of my dad. And, like I have no idea what that means because I was so young. And or when Father's Day comes around and people are like hanging out with their dads, and like I'm not, you know, and when I was a kid, like I didn't, and that it was very, and you get used to this identity that is not normal or common, you know, like it's not common, well, depending where you are, for like people to have, you know, a dead parent. So when you do, you just get used to that, and it's like some of these kids like didn't have great relationships with the people that died too. That's another thing as well. So you never want to be like, you never want to assume anything about how they're feeling about that. And a lot of them have attached their like family role. Like some of them had to become, you know, like, well, I'd like the quote unquote other parent, right? And so how does that change?
Step up and you need to be the man of the household, or you need to take care of your younger siblings. Or
especially if there's like an energy like imbalance, like I noticed, like I took on a lot more like feminine characteristics or personality traits. My sister took on a lot more masculine traits, as she's older than me. And so like looking back, like it was like very much because there was that void of that energy, because my mom was very hypersensitive. I was very hypersensitive, and like you'll notice these environments and groups that they naturally kind of create a balance. And that when a kid is impressionable, as my sister was 10 years old, where you don't have an identity, it's easy to just take on things that you feel you need. And so like you will just accumulate what's like left for you to take in your family environment, your friend environment, whether you want to or not. And you just it becomes at that age, especially as a teenager, when you're like, that is the age of figuring out who you are, right? Although I think it's a lifelong process. Like that, you start to just like attach to it, and like, this is who I am. This is how I've been, or I'm this now because of this, and that's not going to change. And that's like a really dangerous spot to be in a place that's that rigid and unwavering, because anything that's that stiff or unwavering is fear, you know, like that's why you create that. But I think that it was like national, it's a day for everything now, but like there was like a national grief day or something like that ago. But I think it's really important that it's not really talked about, because like one of my friends' stepdad just passed away, and he went down to visit because he lives in a different state. And it's just his mom now. And, you know, like everyone's there, like in the first like month or a couple months, not everybody, like if you have a good family, like everyone's there. But like after that, like the drop off is pretty significant, support you have. And that's when they need it the most, when everybody's gone, when there's no one there, when like there's not support of the family unit or a friend unit.
Because initially it's just busy. People are busy. They're just
keeping their mind going. Funeral, you're talking to this person. Yep. And then nobody checks on those people. And then like that space is like the most vulnerable space, because that's like, it's really instead of like 1 to 3 months, it's really like a whole year of like post that death, to to really process that. And it's a lifelong thing, but that year is really, really important that not a lot of people get support, let alone kids, because it's like, okay, you got to go back to school. It's like, and then like you change because people look at you differently when you're, especially kids, like when they're very aware of like how people perceive them, right? Because they're trying to fit in.
Oh, absolutely.
And so when you know that everybody knows that your mom, dad, brother, sister died, and that people are treating you differently, like you start to like turtle up and shell up because it's like I'm being treated differently, and like is something wrong, like and you start to ask these questions about your own self, and have a hard time processing that. So,
and then if you're thinking that not only are you going through this, now you're feeling a certain way. How could they do this to me? Why did they do this to me? They left, and now I'm feeling a certain way, or I'm looked at in a different way. If you were going to give, if there's a parent listening to this, or even just someone going through their own grief, if there's one thing that they can do as far as self-care, either for themselves or for a child, what would be one piece of advice you'd give?
Find support. Like there's a lot more of like what we do available, and they're almost always free. Like these, it's entirely free for the kid to come. They set up a program, and these kids make like some of them like lifelong friendships with their peers, and they can finally have a friend group that's like understands. Maybe not entirely, but enough. Like that understands enough, and they can be emotionally vulnerable with, which is what most teens have a hard time with. People in general. So find some support in your community, because you don't have to be alone with this. And like I was always very introverted, and so like I never talked about my feelings because I always feel like I could deal with them myself, or I should deal with them myself. Like I don't want support. Self-reliance is like can be a powerful thing, but like at some point you need help. And it's not, you're not weak, and you're not lesser for seeking out help. So find in your community, or find people that you can maybe even create a support group. There's a lot of online groups right now that are for grief that are really, really helpful. And for a lot of people, just need to share. Like they just need to open up. Again, it's not about like feeling better. It's just about connecting. So yeah, that would be my advice.
I can't even imagine how powerful that would have been, having something like that growing up. It's the amount of times that we've had deaths in our family, and again, when you're younger, you just look to other people for cues about what's acceptable of how to feel, right? And never actually tapping into how you feel yourself and letting yourself feel through all these emotions that are going on throughout you. And we don't give kids that space to do that, and we don't allow ourselves that space to do that.
And even if we're talking about building men, think about as men going through something challenging, you feel like you need to be that, I got this.
I can't cry. Like I got to hold together.
I got to be there for everyone else.
I will take care of all these things. But when you're not truly experiencing that emotion or having someone to reach out to, that's when it'll show up in a different way.
Where is that coming up in your life?
It will come up somewhere.
Yeah. And again, what people need is just space to express that. Like especially as a man, like like these men's groups. Like I connect with a bunch of people in these men's groups. It's like having space to express that emotion. That be that vulnerable. Because it's a vulnerable thing to express, like fear over loss or death and that grief. So if you know somebody who has experienced a loss, like see if you can be that for them. And that's a scary place to be too, as somebody to hold that space. But it's very, very simple. Just like check in on that person, It doesn't take much, because you'll be surprised what they may be even waiting for that, and then no one's just even offered that to them. Especially if it's a kid too, just to be able to express that, or even like learn how to express that. Because my dad died when I was 6, but like I'm only 27 now. Like there's gonna be a lot more deaths that I'm gonna go through my entire life. If I had not learned how to process that, or had my own spiritual experiences, or these support groups, or just like a good family to talk to, which not every kid does, I would be for the worse, and that's death is that's a big thing that I talk about too, and part of why I was drawn to psychedelics and I guess more comfortable in those experiences is because I was always very comfortable in like the dark. I was always very comfortable in my darkness. Had like a lighter, my own flame in my soul. No, but yeah, it was like learning to be in that negative space, or that darkness feels bad. Like no one wants to be there. But like when you can detach that, I'm not that feeling, right? I am not that what happened to me. Then you can start to study it a little bit, understand it, and you can start to like observe it without this fear of it becoming who you are. And that's when you start to learn about it, in that darkness, in that space.
So this is going to be part one of 2 parts, without a doubt. We've already
we
haven't gotten into the,
no. This is like
we haven't gotten into your writing, your artwork, the podcast that you're
which
doing,
is fucking awesome,
adventure.
by the way. But
thank you.
Yeah. I wanted to know about how your background in architecture and psychedelics and your love for art. The way that your artwork looks is a very spacey kind of
unique. And I also wanted to get into just yoga and understanding it. Yeah, it's like because I listened to the one you did an Instagram live with the one girl.
Oh, Ivana, yeah.
That was amazing because again, all these questions that people that I didn't understand and I didn't know, and you kind of break it down and make it very digestible, and I was like, that was awesome. So I'd love to get into that
like
too.
Make it like a straw, you can sip it.
Exactly. Yes, let's bring it back to the straws.
Bring it and wrap it back around. That's what we do well here.
Circle back, John.
That's it. So we'd love to have you back on.
Yeah.
Back in studio again. We'll get into the second part. We'll talk more about how the podcasts were developed. We'll go in that direction with the art and this and that. But tell us where we can find you. How can the Building Men audience reach you?
Yeah, I'm most active on Instagram. So that's _Johnathan _Matthew _ because fucking names.
Normal of a name, yeah.
Yeah, I have 3 first names. My name is Johnathan Arnold Matthew, so I got 3 first names technically. Like Ricky Bobby. That's what I relate myself to. So on Instagram, you can also
Jesus.
I don't know what to do with my hands. And then theweeklyway.com. The Weekly Way is a newsletter and a podcast. It's a really short podcast. It's only 15 minutes. I do it once a week. And the Weekly Way is just really giving you perspective on your life. And so I call it the Weekly Way because a big part of what I do is what's helped me is the way I organize my schedule in my life is I break it down. I used to do it by like months or like tasks, but now I break it down by week because it really gives me perspective. Like if I'm in like, we're in the 50th week of 52 weeks in 2021, and that's like, oh shit, there's only 2 weeks left because it's like, this is the time of the year where everyone's like, wow, that year really flew by. And it's like, I never have that because I'm always very aware of where I am and I break it up into segments. And so each week I go through a different topic on how you can improve through self-discipline, practices of self-awareness, meditations, understanding self-compassion, a little bit of spirituality, just offering that perspective that might change your week. So, yeah.
Love that. Tremendous. Any final thoughts, Anthony?
Yeah. Wait, let me just switch that over. There we go. So what's one thing, you gave us some little golden nuggets that people can take away, but what's one thing that the Building Men audience can do tomorrow to better themselves spiritually, emotionally, mentally, physically, whatever way you want to go, but what's one practice they could start to do and do it tomorrow?
Yeah, so this is one that's really important to me. It's an old practice. It's a yoga practice. It's called neti neti. So what that means, it translates from Sanskrit, is not this or not that. And so what the practice is as a thought enters your mind, or it's really more like an active practice, but I do it all the time with thoughts and emotions too. But you dig deep and you identify, well, am I my body? I'm not that, right? You see neti neti. You don't have to say that. You can say, I say like, nope, or not this. Okay, am I this a thought? Is that thought me? Like, no, that's not it. Like, am I that? No, I'm not that. So it's just really just like cutting away, like Bruce Lee, hack away at the unessential, right? And so it's this practice of non-identification, because for me, I'm like thinking all the time, and I can get caught in these conversations, which a lot of people do, or caught in emotions. So if you can just, like, anytime it pops up, especially if you're doing a task that you're being pulled away from your focus, just say like, oh, actually, there's a thought. Oh, I'm thinking. Oh, like, oh, that's an emotion. Because the more you can observe it as something that's not you, the less it has control over you. And you'll start to observe patterns, and you'll start to get proactive with identifying it, and you'll start to get more silence in your mind. And that's where you get the moments of inspiration happen, when you can create that space. So
my favorite part of the podcast is your question at the very end, the wrap up, because it's
every time it's something different.
Takeaway that someone can implement right away. I'm glad that we're doing that now. Neti.
I am not that fucking straw. I'll tell you that
there you go.
I am the sucker of the straw.
It looks so good in your mouth.
It does look good in my mouth.
Building Men, you can find us on Instagram, building.men, buildingmencoach@gmail.com. Website is buildingmen.io. The way I wanted to end this episode too is take a minute and think about who's more of a fucking badass man, right? The guy, there's a drunk guy in the train who wants to, he's caught, obviously out of his mind with what's going on. So who's more of a man? The guy that, like, back up everyone, I'm going to fuck this dude up, I'm going to throw him into the wall, beat the fuck out of him. Or the man who says, come over here, let me help you. What can I do? What can I do to help you right now? Rub your back and tell me what's going on in your life. That's more of a fucking badass, that dude right there. He not only diffused the situation, he helped someone process through and heal some shit. So on the surface, it might look like, the guy who wants to bust everybody up and kick someone's ass, yeah, he's a fucking man. You know what? The dude who said, come here, let me help you through this, that's a fucking man right there.
Yeah.
Go a step further than you thought you can go. We'll see you next time on Building Men.